Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Voice of Authority webinar brought to you today by Summix. My name is Toby Fox. I'm the Managing Director at 3Fox, the marketing agency for councils. Our job is to keep our network of councils and developers and investors and their influencers and advisors connected. And since lockdown began, we've been doing that through this channel, the Voice of Authority, a platform for councils to discuss their ambitions and challenges, influences, and issues of urgency. As we make our way towards the end of the current restrictions, whenever and whatever that is, we're as determined as ever to keep the conversation going and keep our network communicating. And to that end, we're going to be back on Thursday on our sister channel, 3Fox Presents, at 11 a.m. with Scape and an expert panel to talk about construction procurement, specifically delivering better outcomes and preparing for the construction playbook. And you can register for that at 3fox.co.uk. But today we're discussing new settlements in the Oxford-Cambridge Arc. Now, according to the government's introduction to the Oxford-Cambridge Arc spatial framework, the region has experienced population growth higher than anywhere except London, up 17% since 2000. And new towns and villages might provide the most straightforward way to accommodate such rapid growth. But the Arc's residents will demand a persuasive case for speedy development. So can we provide people with new places that are free from the growing pains of established towns and cities, rather than creating a fast track to the same old problems? And successful places have a historical context that makes sense of them for residents and for visitors, meaning that runs through them like words in a stick of rock, even as appearances and activities evolve and change. So can that meaning be manufactured? And can we make places that give people the opportunity to change so that the way we live is sustainable? And the government and the region's local authorities have been really clear. Development in the Arc must improve the environment rather than detract from it. How's that possible? These are some knotty questions, but we've got some clear and incisive minds to cut right through them for us today. And it's a privilege and a pleasure to welcome to the Voice of Authority in alphabetical order, Bev Hindle, who is Executive Director at the Oxford-Cambridge Arc Leadership Group, and Hannah Smart, who is Director at Edge Urban Design, and Lord Matthew Taylor, author of the Garden Communities Policies Adopted by Government and Chair of the West Carclays Eco Community in Cornwall. Over the next hour, we're going to have three conversations about the strategic planning role of garden villages for the Arc, about embedding sustainability principles in planning and design and development, and about a case study of one new settlement that's being designed in Harrington in Oxfordshire. And we'd like you to join in those conversations, viewers. So make use of the Q&A function to send in and vote for questions to the panel. The more concise your question, the more likely we are to pick it up. If you'd like to share more extensive thoughts with our panel and viewers, then please do make use of the chat function. We've also got a little poll that we're going to run just to whet your appetites and help us sort of fuel the conversation. And we'll pop that in and you can contribute by answering that when it pops up on your screens later. In the meantime, let's start the conversation. The strategic planning role of garden villages for the Arc. Bev, can you lead us off on that?
Thanks very much, Toby, and good morning, everyone. I think, first of all, there needs to be understood that there is a place for strategic planning in the first place. You know, the Arc is an opportunity. The government is clearly rolling out the idea of a large-scale, long-term regional planning exercise that will eventually become national planning policy. And I'm here to advocate for that because I think that's long overdue. So I think once you've set that context that you're going to have that kind of a planning framework, that is absolutely the place where new communities and large settlements, or new settlements rather, need to be considered. Because the reality is, and there are exceptions, but very few, where local authorities will really grasp the nettle and take on a whole new community as part of their local planning process. They simply don't either have the numbers to justify in that period of time or the confidence of delivery within their plan period. And that's really missing out a major element of our options in terms of what we might be thinking about for future growth. So I think once you start looking at a scale of geography like the Arc, from Oxfordshire to Cambridgeshire, once you start thinking about a 30-year time horizon, and once you get away from the idea of specific allocations, but more into directions of growth, I think there's a fantastic opportunity to be able to test new settlements and their benefits potentially against those other options that we're very much used to, whether it's urban extensions, whether it's regeneration, all in the hopes, ultimately, as you said, Toby, that we want to deliver sustainable development. And I think there's a serious option that we've been missing out in that testing process simply because the processes aren't there to align to that. Now, I think one thing before we go on, I think it's really, really important. I think they have to stand up on their own merit. It's not like we're doing a large scale plan, therefore they should be new settlements. They need to be tested. They need to be rigorously applied to the testing criteria of, are you delivering sustainable communities? Are you creating communities that are going to be able to thrive, rather than, I think, as Lord Taylor has paraphrased in the past, rather than just a housing site in the middle of nowhere. And I think that's really where we need to get down into the detail of understanding the role of these new settlements. And for me, for one, we don't tend to get to talk about them that much because, again, as I say, the options simply don't get presented in the normal planning process. So I really, really welcome the opportunity to scrutinize these and finally have an option and an opportunity to look at their role in future growth for the ARC.
That's fantastic, Bev. Great start. Thank you very much indeed. So Matthew, is there anything you'd like to pick up on in what Bev said? And is there anything you'd like to add to that sort of understanding of the strategic role of new settlements in the ARC?
So Bev talked about the importance of strategic planning. And I really came in on this in 2008 when I did Living Working Countryside, which was the review of rural housing and economy and the planning system, whether it was working. And it intrigued me as a Cornish MP at the time, with lots of market towns and small villages, that in a place that actually had a lot of countryside, we were focusing all our building in enveloping existing towns and villages. We had, again, big growth, very like Oxfordshire, Cambridgeshire. And that's partly children. So people were having more children, they were living longer, and some incomers coming in as well. But it's actually led by people living longer whilst also having more children. And what you were finding was that market towns had reached capacity. So what was argued as a sustainable development by building an estate on the edge of an existing place was both ruining the context of the place and adding to the issues of services, traffic jams, and the rest of it within the community. And I saw this as a capacity issue. And the question was why? When you look, and I looked back at the origins of planning and the Planning Act in the 1940s and the changes that were made, they were also facing the issues of growth. They wanted to house people better, so they were facing issues of renewal, and they were looking for urban regeneration post-war bombing, but also because the industries are moving out, the smokestack industries moving out of the city centres. And they came up with an answer on that, which was planning as placemaking, not planning as development control. That's a complete, in my view, that's not planning at all. Development control has a function, but it's the function of applying planning. Planning itself is strategic and placemaking. And they had three legs to the stool. They wanted to regenerate the bombed out quarters, the slums, the declining smokestack industries. They wanted to stop urban sprawl, partly to keep the setting and sense of place, but also to encourage, where you were going to grow those places, the renewal of the old, which was more expensive. Exactly the issues we have today. But they also understood, in creating the green belts, in protecting the urban fringe, in applying a system that said you just can't build anywhere, at a time of growth, you needed something else. Because if you're going to restrict through planning for the first time, you also needed to allow the homes that people needed. And that, of course, was new towns, building on the idea of the garden cities that Ebenezer Howard had. And those new towns were built in the context of the time. So state planning, moving industries, moving people effectively lock, stock and barrel, but the slum clearances, but nonetheless, it was a three-legged stool, all about placemaking, reshaping existing communities, adding very carefully to existing, but actually protecting the urban edge, which was the green belt. That was the purpose of the green belt. But in order to then release the numbers, add the new towns. What happened was actually that delivered really successfully. It delivered the numbers. And by the late 70s, early 80s, we were in housing balance. We had net migration out of the country, birth rates had fallen, but we'd also built millions of homes, 4.5 million of them in new towns. So we stopped the program because we didn't need them, and because we built so much that the urban centres were being emptied out. And I grew up in the era of the Liverpools, the Birminghams, the Manchesters being hollowed out, and indeed London, Camden, Islington, the East Ends, Southwark. These were places that were hollowed out of people, hollowed out of industry, and we needed to concentrate. And you had Michael Heseltine with the Urban Task Force. So it made complete sense to end the New Towns programme, to expand the Green Belt because we didn't want to build there, and to deliver the homes in the urban regeneration areas that were needed. The problem was that didn't continue. the population went back up, people started having more children, the baby boomers had their generation of children, creating the second great baby boom, and we had migration coming back into the country. And what we tried to do, and we'd of course redevelop the city. So many of these rundown places were now thriving places. You having to knock down homes to build new homes. But we didn't go back to the new towns. We acted as if new towns were somehow the terrible destruction of the countryside. And what we got instead was urban edge development, the very thing that the Planning Act in the 1940s tried to stop. So what's the answer for the ARC? We're back to growth, much of it locally generated by people living longer and having more children, but some of it migration, some of it economic, because we need people to work in those factories as other people get older and retire. So we need to find those homes. And what people, I think, really have objected to is very poor quality estates built around the towns, and through development control processes, really, always squeezing the minimum amount of land to deliver the maximum houses, and then people got the very thing that they didn't want, which is a densely packed, not very attractive and still expensive housing estate with no services, which has added to the problems of where do you go to school, how do you get to the shops, the traffic congestion and the rest of it. And my proposition was simple: bring back the original third leg of the stool, which is give communities the option of new settlements, and do it in exactly the same way that they thought, Ebenezer Howard thought pre-war, and the new towns thought afterwards, which is take land of little value, i.e. agricultural value, not development value, and take part of that development value to create place, to create the shops, pubs, schools, and things that people need. And in the 21st century context, sustainable new communities, not as the only option, but to allow people to protect the historic Oxford or the historic Cambridge or the historic village in the countryside from overdevelopment, but still house people in the places that people actually want to live and where they've often grown up themselves. So I'm very clear, but it comes back to Bev's point. It's about strategically planning for the future of the ARC and not just incrementally adding housing estates.
Yeah, and it's really interesting that there seems, I mean, from a layman's point of view, there seems to be a sort of universal acceptance of new towns and garden settlements, that generation of settlements as being really well designed and lovely places to live and well thought of. As I say, I'm a layman, so I accept there may be challenges to that. But it is interesting that we've lost sight of that, and that hasn't yet come back into the sort of general understanding of what's happening in the ARC, and that's perhaps going to be reflected in some of our later conversation, I think. And Bev and Hannah are really happy for you to pick up on any of the themes that Matthew's picked out there. Just shout out if you'd like to. But Hannah, I'd also like to know a little bit about what this means from a practitioner's point of view. You know, when you're looking at this sort of strategic role of new settlements as a practitioner, what do you see?
Morning, everyone, by the way. So yeah, for me, I think Matthew said a lot of this, but it's much more about, you know, delivering 1 million homes in the ARC. You know, it's not just a train line, which I think a lot of people do think it is, or 2 train lines. And it's, you know, the ARC is encouraging growth east to west, where it's been lacking for many years. We've been really good at connecting the UK north to south, but not in the other direction. So as an urban designer and a practitioner and master planner, for me, and I can't help but grab a drawing off of my desk, actually. We've called it the sausage supercluster, the sausage being the ARC, but this idea that actually the ARC it's not an ARC, but it's a cluster, a supercluster of places that are connected together, with a kind of area of interest that is stretching from Swindon to Peterborough to Rugby to Hemel Hempstead and everywhere in between. And it's a vast network of places that are interconnected with a multitude of movement corridors and networks of many different modes, which is really interesting to us. I think I'll talk more about this later with a specific example, but it's that kind of the beauty of connecting places and creating new places that fit together and form part of that puzzle, rather than just acting kind of on a one-to-one basis. It's about how they fit together. That's the kind of message I would get across as an urban designer.
Fantastic. Thanks, Hannah. Now, Bev, I know you want to, I'll come to you again, Matthew, in just a second, but Bev, you wanted to come in.
Yeah, just really quickly. I mean, I just want to make sure that we understand that for me, politically, one of the difficulties about new towns, or one of the perceptions of new towns, is that it requires development corporations, or it requires large scale new governance models to be able to deliver these things. And I think that's one of the things we're going to have to grapple in this strategic thinking. And I think if we do this at a strategic level, we can have that thought in advance rather than thinking that there's some sort of desperation. We need to plunk something in here and derive something forward. So I think there's something around that hopefully we're going to be able to bring out in the conversation today. I think the second thing is picking up something Hannah said. If you do not attack this from a strategic sense and a long range planning sense, then your ability to embed these new places into that cluster, into that polycentric region, become more difficult. And I think that's where, particularly at a local authority level, you will almost always delete back to or defer back to the existing parts of those clusters. Now, some can maybe take some more growth. Some can adequately want growth, but many shouldn't and can't. But they do, because they are the option of least resistance in terms of being able to get through a local plan. And I think that's the point of, if you're going to plan that properly and be able to embed Ebenezer Howard's Garden Town principles, you've got to be able to have that forward thinking. Otherwise, I think you're just always chasing the game. Thanks.
Thank you. Matthew.
Well, firstly, yes, it's about a 50-year vision. And I sat down with councillors in Liscard who were complaining about the housing numbers they got over the next 5 years. And I said, but it's kind of irrelevant, because what's it going to be like in 30 years or 50 years? And how would you plan that? And I said, do you want to be ringed with development, or might you want to create a big urban extension with a park between the old and the new? Or would you like or a new supplement? And these numbers are big, but they're no bigger than you're going to get. But at the moment, you're dealing with it 100 at a time, and all you get 100 at a time is a housing estate. Whereas if you think about 30 or 40 or 50 years ahead, what would a fantastic place be? And would it be a larger Liscard, or would it be a new supplement? Because that's the choice. And if you can just bring up two shots I use in every lecture on this, sure. It just shows that choice. And this is, let's think of this as anywhere town. In essence, that's today. We're ringing places with housing estates because we don't think you can build in the countryside, or actually, more accurately, it was before the Garden Communities programme started to come in. But it's still the attitude of many councillors, and you could probably ring some of those surrounding villages. And part of this is Greenbelt, part of this is AONB, part of this is untouched countryside, but we're actually building only on the fields immediately around the city. They're the ones that generate the view, the historic context of place. They are the field at the bottom of people's gardens that they'd actually like to walk the dog on and fly a kite and go blackberrying. Probably they're not even allowed on it at all at the moment. But this is very sensitive land. And because it's predictably the only land for development, it's also the most expensive land in the country to develop. And hence, you just get lots of little boxes. If you go to the next slide, this is the choice I wanted to give people. Similar amounts of development, protecting the historic context of the market town, but with new, effectively, villages or smaller market towns, some of them linked to a railway route, some of them linked to an existing place, none of them in the Greenbelt, but these are all choices. They could be anywhere, but they're not taking up more fields. They're just taking up different fields. And I think we have to ask ourselves, why do we build at the moment only on the fields that are of the greatest value, both to the local people because they're the setting of their community, and also in financial terms, and therefore you get the least good development. Now, I'm not saying you only do one or the other. I'm saying empower communities to make this choice.
That's fantastic. It was a point well made. So clearly put. Let's talk a little bit about how we embed the principles of sustainability and how we use this opportunity to actually improve people's lifestyles and improve people's way of life, and how you make sure that carries through the planning and development process. How is it that you're going to get people to believe that this is possible?
I think this is where the nub of the critique comes, and it's the point that we need to get across, but we also need to manage. So first of all, get it across. It is very often thought that when you talk about a few thousand homes in a new settlement, what you're actually talking about is housing estates in the countryside. The conversation is often about homes, not place and community. And people will immediately say, well, how will people get into town? There'll be loads more people on the roads. Well, of course, that's not true of any existing town, whether it's Eynsham in Oxfordshire or Truro in Cornwall. these places are thriving communities where most of what people do every day is within that community. So the absolute core for new settlements is that we are not building homes. We are not starting with the transport links to get elsewhere. And I've often heard the fundamental starting point is what's the road or what's the railway? No, no, absolutely not. The fundamental starting point is creating internalization, self-containment, the things that make a thriving, successful place in the 19th century and in the 20th century apply equally much in the 21st century. So it's about shops and pubs and schools, playing fields, jobs, enterprise. Enterprise costs in the modern world, usually SMEs, home working, all of these things that we've seen within coronavirus. And really, coronavirus has made us aware of this really strongly, because it's made us aware of the importance of being able to work from home or near home and not commute. It's made us aware of the importance of walkability. It's made us aware of the importance of the corner shop and the local services and facilities. And of course, it's made people desire access to the countryside and to parks and to green space personally. All of these things can be offered by new settlements if you capture the land value to deliver these services. I don't mean no profit for anyone, because then they're not viable. But you start with land that only has value above agriculture by virtue of the decision to create the place. And the cost of entry for anyone promoting a new settlement, and I apply that to a local authority and to the private sector and to government, the cost of entry to establish the decision to take a new settlement should be that quality of place. I often say to landowners, your ticket to build 2,000 homes is you're going to build right up front schools, shops, doctors' surgeries, school, cafes, parks. That's the cost of entry. Otherwise, forget it, because we'll go somewhere else, because there's an awful lot of countryside in the UK. Nearly 90% isn't built on. Even in the southeast, 88% not built on. So, you know, this is doable. And I want to just give some images of what I mean by that, because one of the things that people often do is they build housing estates and then reluctantly at the end they might put in a Morrison's. That is not placemaking. I looked at Eynsham in Oxfordshire when I was doing Living Working Countryside and then the Garden Communities programme, not because there's now actually a proposal as it happens for an extension under the Garden Community brand, but I looked at it because it was a very typical place. I can give you the figures: 2,020 homes. There's just over 200 enterprises. There's a huge range of shops, cafes, stores. They're all low cost. They're mostly run by local entrepreneurs because it costs very little to go in. Some succeed, some don't. But these are low rent. They're probably mostly below rateable value. And this is what traditional places look like. And these places are on the corners. There's a hub in the middle of cafes and restaurants and shops, but actually they're also scattered through the community. So everything is walkable and deliverable. And this isn't a chocolate box, Oxfordshire Town. This could be anywhere really in the UK. And it thrives on this basis. And actually post-coronavirus, these are exactly the kind of enterprises that currently are thriving and not the ones that are closing down in the bigger high streets. And people say to me, oh yeah, but this is idealistic. It can't be delivered. It absolutely can. We'll take a very quick shot of Panbury, which people know. I take people there quite a lot, but not to show them the architecture, because there's a million different ways of doing the architecture. It's just to show these are little enterprises. All of their shops virtually are already fitted out. There's no fit out cost to go in. They've got the loo and the sink and the storeroom at the back and the roof and the ceiling and the electric points and the plumbing. And they're under 1,000 square feet. They don't pay rates. The rents are low. They are commercially, they've been commercially valuable to the duchy, but it's slow burn. And almost all of them are occupied by local entrepreneurs. Actually, the majority women. Many of them returning to work. And this is not just one bit. You know, this is a part of Panbury. It's a particularly successful little square, but there's much more of this kind of mixed retail, including corner shops and so on. Mostly in the corner shops, convertible to flats if needs be. And then people say, well, but Panbury, it's the duchy. It's very unusual. And the duchy is very aware of that. They have to make a profit. They're under treasury rules to do it, but they've got a long burn for it. But it is a bit bespoke. So they've tried in Newquay to do the same. Poundbury use plan, I just want to point out, Bradley Stoke, rather, that's how developers tend to, even if they're doing a large place, they'll do a shopping centre, some Morrison's or whatever, and then they'll do lots of houses. That is not a walkable community that will be successful. Poundbury's land use plan, you can see how the enterprise is mixed in through the community. There's a series of squares and so on, but it works really well. It's delivered more than one job per home.
And there's an interesting point here about Poundbury, isn't there, Matthew? That we get hung up about the design, about what it looks like, without really thinking about the composition, about how it's made.
Exactly. So, some people love Poundbury for how it looks, other people hate Poundbury for how it looks, but actually what they need to concentrate on is the walkability, the local facilities, the way that they've mixed homes in, that it makes sense as you walk around it. Another designer once said to me that a place works when a child can tell you where they live, not by the street name, but by the landmarks you walk past to get to their home. And modern estates very rarely have that. Having delivered leaflets in them, I can tell you they're easy to get lost in.
I think it's interesting that I interviewed David Luntz recently, who is the chief exec at Old Oak and Park Royal Development Corporation, where they're building 25,000 homes, a whole new town in London, in West London, and he was admiring Poundbury, not in all aspects, but elements of it. So it's important to kind of pick out the successful elements of these places, rather than just putting getting rid of the baby with the bathwater. I've
done a lot of work with Peter Freeman, who of course delivered King's Cross, and there is much that's brilliant about King's Cross, but mostly it's the placemaking, the detailing of place. It's the little children's play areas. It's the places that you can picnic by the water. The original house builder partners that he had wanted to just build flats along the canal because that would be the easiest to sell first. And Peter said, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to use the canal to create place. And you see St. Martin's Square, but you also see the little children's swings in a corner. You see the retention of, and of course it's now held up as remarkably successful. And he wants to do the same with new places. And I worked with him on some projects on that. So it's the thoughtfulness of place creation. But the irony is, actually, we know how to do it in urban renewal. There are bad examples and good examples, but people do think about the mix of uses. They are long-term investors in place generally. So it's often long-term funds that are involved in it. King's Cross with the Post Office Pension Fund, only possible because of that long-termism. And yet, when we build houses, they're built by people who just build houses. And all they want to do is the maximum number of houses at the lowest cost and the highest price, phase them into the market as slowly as possible to maintain those high prices. And anything else is a cost. Whereas the urban regeneration people tend to understand that it's about generating value. And that without the shops and the pubs and the businesses and the homes all put together successfully, you don't really create value. And that was understood when they created Bath. It was understood when they created Port Sunlight. But somehow we're having to relearn this lesson. And at Nansledden, the interesting thing about these little shops, same principles as at Poundbury, but much of the development at Nansledden being led by Wayne Holmes, who are, I think they might object, but effectively they're a regional persimmon. In terms of reputation and the kind of houses they typically build, but here they're building them. They own the section. They're delivering them. They're using their standard house types, but dressed differently, but in street patterns that are very, very different. And these shops occupied. There's now 3 cafes there, successfully operating, and a series of shops: a flower shop, a wedding shop. A solicitors have gone into these little units that cost very little cost to go in. Again, don't pay rates. But they've been occupied. The first cafe was in before they built 200 homes. At 500 homes today, there are 3 cafe restaurants all operating. If you went there now, you'd see the seats out in the street. The first one relied somewhat on the builders, but what they're doing, of course, is delivering greater pace and a 15% premium on the Persimmon estate down the road. And people absolutely love it. It's a simpler design approach than Poundbury. It is still a retro approach, if I can put it like that. But I mean, I'm a great fan of the 20s and 30s. You could do it like that. I'm a great fan of living with nature and some of the modern designs that use wood and glass and trees and bring people in with very eco design. Let 1,000 flowers bloom in terms of the architecture, but the placemaking principles are universal. And the final point is, what we need to do to guarantee this is not simply say this is great, because people are used to things like this being pitched and then all they get is the housing estate and viability arguments and all the rest of it. So you need absolutely clear rules. You need the local authorities adopting the policies before they adopt the site, so that people know that the price of entry, it is not that you've been allocated and now you can build what you like on viability and argue it on viability, degrade it. That is the price of entry. And the starting point is how you will deliver that, who will deliver that, what the process of delivery is, and how it will be maintained long term.
Well, that's fantastic stuff, Matthew. Thank you very much indeed. Now, we polled the audience earlier on whether they believe these sorts of communities can be created, and we got 16% of our audience against that idea and 21% undecided. So it'd be really interesting to see towards the end of this this webinar how those opinions are shifting. And I suspect Poundbury isn't the example to shift those attitudes. And Hannah, it's all very well, isn't it, to talk about Poundbury, but it's the Duchy, and it is different from other places. So how doable is this from a master planner, from a designer's point of view?
What I would say is it's great to hear there's so many female entrepreneurs there, Matthew. That's great. I guess I'm sat in Tame right now in Oxfordshire, and I think that's another really good example of a place that does that really well. You know, it is a place for local people, and it has got, you know, lots of great shops on the high street. And I also would relate my experience back to Oxfordshire, because I'm going to talk about that later on as well. And in a way, zoom out as well as zoom back in, because you know, we do things really well in Oxfordshire, but you could arguably say that Cambridge and Cambridgeshire actually does them better than us. Like sometimes they're a bit more forward thinking and a bit braver than we are. Not to say that that can't change, I'm sure that will. But for me, there's this thing I'm always mulling over, and it relates back to what Matthew was saying about settlements, new settlements versus growing settlements. Do we follow the path of conservation, or do we follow innovation? And how do those two things sit next to each other? Because sustainability is about, you know, walkability and internalization and solar panels and all of that stuff. But actually, there is a much bigger question right from the outset, and that is about how we, you know, work with what we've got. Do we create a new settlement? Do we expand existing settlements? And how do we work with conservation and cities like Oxford that have so much rich heritage and listed buildings? And you know, we don't necessarily want to dilute or touch those, but we do have an incredible base of innovation and technology in Oxfordshire, and we should be embracing that. So for me, it's kind of starting sustainability at that really big picture level, and then drawing it down to the nuts and bolts of creating streets and spaces, buildings, homes, high streets, green spaces, habitats and biodiversity. And you know, it's not just about the nitty-gritty nuts and bolts of solar panels and wind farms, but it's that kind of the existence of the places, and not considering all the retrofitting that happens later on. It is really like sustainability for me starts really big, and then it's kind of continuing that theme and drawing it all the way down through the placemaking journey, from vision and the arc right the way down to reserve matters applications and getting bricks and, you know, on the ground. So it's sustainability should really be about, you know, the DNA of the place from A all the way to Z and everything in between. So sorry, I've done quite a slight curveball there, but I think it is important that we're thinking big all the time, because the detail will always follow.
Yeah, no, that's a fine curveball, and hopefully we've answered viewer B Farrell's question to an extent. But B, we're actually going to have a look at B's asking how the things that Matthew was describing can be done, and who's involved, and what could it look like in Oxford's Arc. And we've got an example of that coming up, B. So we'll be showing you any second now one of the new towns that's being talked about and planned for the Arc. But before we get on to that, Bev, is there anything in what you've heard? You've been very patient, first of all. Thank you very much indeed. Anything in what you heard that you'd like to pick up on, and perhaps explain a bit about the role of the leaders group and the local authorities in setting the agenda here for environmental sustainability?
Thanks, Toby. I mean, I've learned over COVID that I come to these webinars sometimes to speak, but most of the time, almost always to learn and listen. And I think what's really fascinating to me is I think there is a very distinct and a very specific role local authorities individually, but almost particularly collectively need to play, which is to create those principles, those place principles, the environment principles that they want to see and they expect their communities to be upheld against. Now, they should be learning and listening because sometimes they don't know what they can have. And I think that's part of the listening and learning from examples elsewhere. But then we absolutely should be applying those. If we can give that confidence and that absolute clarity of what we expect, then there's a fair test of the options that come down the road. And then there's a measure to be able to hold development to that to that standard as we go forward. And I think that's what both Matthew and Hannah spoke to. And I think that's really important. In the ARC, we've developed the ARC, for instance, the shared ARC environmental principles. And we think these are a really great starting place for then being able to then define what does doubling nature look like? What does 20% biodiversity look like as opposed to 10%? And can we achieve that viably in these new communities? I think Hannah said it well. And sort of Matthew, I think we need to go back to, I'll go a little bit further back than Matthew did. Look, planning was born out of public health, and there is a public health and well-being awareness now that must be embedded in how we design communities. So walkable streets isn't about how you can avoid being in a car. Walkable streets is about how you can actually make yourself healthier and live longer. And I think this is the point about how you need places that work for communities in terms of making green space be fundamental, not just for the environmental benefits it brings, but for our human benefits that it brings. Humans do not need to be displaced from nature. They should absolutely be designed as part of nature. And I think there is an opportunity for us to add value. So I think that's something local authorities can be clear about. I think that does two things. I think it sets a standard of expectation that needs to then be through a proper process, like we're doing with the spatial framework, to be able to make sure that it's viable, deliverable, and that it's not just pie in the sky as a way to stop development, but actually to get the right development. So I think we can do that. I think that gives confidence to two people. I think that gives confidence to the public because they can see where their views are going to be aired, where their objectives are going to be delivered. And then they can be that authority, and the developers can be held up by the public. Did you deliver what you said you're going to deliver for my benefit and for my public well-being? And I think that's really fundamental to authorities to do that, not to back away from that challenge, but to be absolutely transparent and upfront as part of that process. And I think that's where, with all due respect, places like new settlements will get a fairer due than they perhaps in the past have.
And perhaps the nice aspect here of the climate emergency, empowering them to do that, because local authorities, if they've signed up to a climate emergency, they cannot deliver their objectives on that emergency without taking some of these measures around transport and lifestyles and so on. They have to do that in order to hit their objectives. But in order to hold them to account to that, isn't there a role for data in here? Are we talking about sort of moving this whole debate away from opinion and conjecture and towards sort of facts and scientific evidence and following the data, as we keep being told on a daily basis at the moment?
Absolutely right. Having a proper strategic planning process is a really great opportunity to bring the evidence onto the table. I'm going to try and be careful here because I think my masters will understand when I say this. When you're working at a local plan level, you kind of know ultimately the mantra and the mandate of the council that's in place to deliver the local plan they're trying to deliver. And ultimately, the places you probably shouldn't go and the places that you'd rather not go, but you might be able to go. When you start to look at a larger scale over a longer period of time, you take away some of those local biases to start to look at the evidence. Where are the right places to grow? And what is the right way to grow? And I think that moves away from the potential where you've got long-standing sort of lists of sites that I remember. On one local plan inquiry, I argued why that site shouldn't be included in the local plan. Next local plan, I argued why it should be included in the local plan. Because eventually there's this onion skin layering thing that at some point you've got to get off that hamster wheel and go, wait a second, can I have a fresher perspective? Last thing I'll say, and Toby, and I think it's really, for me, a lesson I learned, again, going back to the Oxfordshire context where I spent some time. When I first got to Oxfordshire and I saw that the local district council was promoting Upper Hayford as a development site, I thought, you've got to be kidding me. This is in the middle of nowhere. How am I, as the county council, supposed to connect these places when you're sticking these developments in the middle of nowhere? What I learned, and going back to, I think, something that's going to be come out in Hannah's presentation, it's not about, well, it is about how those communities connect into other communities, but it's how sustainable and how those places evolve in and of themselves. And what I saw happening and what I see happening at a place like Hayford is some fantastic opportunities, some work by people like Community First Oxford, which are embedding and building community governance and community understanding as that community comes out of the ground. You have infrastructure that the existing community did not have access to, schools, public space, a green space, and opening up, if you like, the sense of a proper community being built, as opposed to just constantly adding the layers on. And that was a real eye opener for me, where the opportunity to build these places is really great. But my one caveat, my one warning is, can we please make sure that we're planning these at the critical mass they need to be from day one, rather than half the settlement and then coming back later and saying, oh, I don't think it's big enough, we need to double it. And if we'd have had that idea, it was double the size, we would have absolutely created different infrastructure solutions, different community solutions. So I think we do have to look at that forward plan, as Matthew said, 30, 50 years, to make sure we're creating these spaces in the right context for the future.
It's a really, really good point. And we want to get on to show one of these places, one of these case studies. Matthew, you've got a point you want to make. If you could be really brief, and then we can move on to the case study, that'd be great.
Add to the best point about the long vision. I see endless debates about whether this council or that council has to have 300 homes a year or 350 homes a year. And I would say, okay, so we're talking about the difference between 10 years or 12 years, but it's going to come anyway, because we know people are living longer and we know they're having children. So let's not worry about whether it's 10 or 12 years, and let's not fight the 200 home housing estate on the grounds of whether we need 150 or 250 and whether it's the right. But actually, let's have a vision about, okay, this is coming. It might be 10 years, it might be 20 years, but what would that look like? And have the confidence that people in the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries had to create place.
Well, I think there's something similar in there in the jobs, isn't there? I mean, this is an area of the country which is really, really successful economically. It's where the jobs are being created, so it's where people want to live, and we can't just deny that. We can be Canute and stand in the water and show people how it can't be stopped. This is where the jobs are being created, so we need to plan for this growth.
But even then, I'd still challenge you, because people talk too much about migration in, even in my own Cornwall. And yes, there is migration in, but the driving force of the housing need is the children of the people who already live there. 80–90% of people who live at Upper Hayford are the children of the people who live in the surrounding villages, who could never afford to live in their surrounding villages. And the reason the parish councils went from opposing it to supporting it is because they realized that it was their children that were living there, but also that Upper Hayford was then protecting those villages from the development they didn't want by creating a new settlement instead.
Matthew, I'm in a house with two 20-year-olds living at home. I'm entirely au fait with that.
I've got concept. 3 sons. The oldest is 14, and now he's turned into the grumpy monster. The sooner they've got a home of their own, the better. Possibly a kennel at the moment.
Let's see what that home might look like. Hannah, tell us all about Harrington.
Thank you. Yeah, very smooth there. I mean, I was going to talk to everyone about a new settlement of 6,500 homes, but hearing what you guys have just said, I think it's just been, it's now 20,000 homes at the back of that, joking aside. Yeah, so, I mean, how can we put this into practice? I think it's quite interesting to reflect and step back. People that aren't in our industry could be forgiven for thinking that this is what success looks like, going from zero to carbon zero in one straight line, and from zero to a new settlement in the space of 5 minutes. However, as we all know, it doesn't look like that. What it actually looks like is trying something, trying it again, going one step backwards, sidestepping, taking 10 steps forward, learning something new, working together, learning from other people. And the point there is that success is about learning and growing, and that's exactly how we create places. So we try something, we learn, we grow, we progress. And if we were to put those into a spatial framework and look at the growth of a place, there are many kind of amazing settlements from towns and cities and villages in the UK that we've all learned lots of great stuff from. So we've learned some great behaviours. We've also learned some things that aren't so great. I'm going to pick up on bin lorries and turning heads and DB32, which I hear lots of crosswords about. And there is a real opportunity for us to create new places, learning from the past behaviours, not forgetting the things that work really well, but also embracing change, looking at how we can change at every phase. So if we're creating a new community, we don't have to set out all of the rules right from the outset. Yes, we may have a framework, but as we build each phase, we can learn, we can tweak it, we can evolve it, we can improve it. So kind of making those positive changes and taking it a phase is really important. I think I want to talk about our core values for this place, which is Harrington in Oxfordshire, before I talk about the wider context of where it sits, because I think it is quite important about change. And we're creating these values, and I've thrown a little joke in here to say they're the golden thread back to the MPPF for all of the planners out there in the audience, but they really are, they're sitting behind placemaking. And I suppose actually COVID has probably made these come to the fore more so. And, we're creating places where people actually want to feel at home and taking it right back to the basics rather than it always having to be so much more complicated than it has been in the past. We're designing places that are around people and around the existing landscape that's already there. There's no point reinventing the wheel. And we're encouraging zero carbon lifestyles because that's our responsibility, as a nation to do so. But we're respecting and reflecting the innovation, the conservation, the landscape, the environment, the existing people that already live there, while supporting the ambitions. And in this case, we're talking about Oxfordshire, so the ambitions of Oxfordshire and the Arc. And so if I then move on to actually where are we talking about, and looking at the strategic context of where we're sitting. So Harrington sits here. This is the Oxford Greenbelt that sits around Oxford. And down here, we've got the Chilterns AONB. So, Oxford is a centre of global research and innovation. It's home to a number of world-leading science and technology companies, which are located across leading business clusters and hubs. It's a hive of knowledge. There's so much great stuff that goes on here. So why not bring all of that together, the work of many hands, and create a place for people and innovation at Harrington? And, it's not possible to create something on that scale if we're just growing existing places. And that's why we think Harrington is a great opportunity to create something new. We've seen in the recent pandemic how valuable Oxford is and its innovation and groundbreaking research and development. And that's something that we should be growing upon. Harrington itself is the only proposal locally that is located outside of the Greenbelt and the OMB. It's the only proposal that can deliver a sustainable standalone settlement of the right scale, which is now 20,000 units, not 6.5, no, I'm joking. It's the only proposal that can offer the level of innovation and scale to support a thriving future Oxfordshire Unitary Authority. And so therefore for us, the story we want to tell is why here next? And the really important thing about that is its identity. So if I zoom in slightly closer, there's a fantastic network of rich existing villages, transport connections. We've got lots of local railway stations. There's some great local towns. Aylesbury Garden Town is growing to the northeast, and Bicester Garden Town slightly further off the map. We've got Oxford, Didcot Garden Town down here, just underneath that map. There's High Wycombe, and there's then this lovely kind of collection of rich villages that sits in the centre. But actually, if we then look at something like the industrial strategy for Oxfordshire, the map is just inserted down in the left-hand corner, and there is a kind of gap that's crying out for a new garden settlement to complete that picture. And that's kind of one of the things that's driving us and helping us to grow. I think the really important things are, we've talked about internalisation and wider connections. And the great thing here is that we have got the wider connections. Harrington as a location doesn't only have everything you need, but it also sits in this space in Oxfordshire that is connected and is sustainable. And there's an existing network of places. So you could jump on a train and go to Birmingham or London. You could get the Oxford Tube, which is just down here at Luke-Naturn, that goes to London and Oxford. Equally, you could put on your walking boots or your flip-flops and or jump on your bike or your horse or get on the local bus. Car share to Oxford, use the park and rides around the city centre, or borrow an electric car from Harrington itself. So for us, Harrington is about a choice of movement. It's not just saying that it's internalisation, but it's also about this wider connectivity. And that's what makes it inherently a sustainable place. So kind of taking it back to that bigger picture. And then I'm just zooming again so you can see exactly where it sits. But it's sitting just on the edge of the M40 at Junction 7. Tame is the local market town to the northeast, which I'm currently sat just about where the H is, ironically. Oxford over here, we've got Wheatley. Luke-Naturn is a great facility locally where you can get buses to Heathrow or to Oxford and London. And so it's also surrounded then by this lovely network of vernacular Oxfordshire villages, of which it can support and they can support it. So for us, Harrington is really the story of a place that is the movement hub, and it's at the centre of everything around it and vice versa. So as a master planner, when I design a place, for me, it's all about what's here now and what's happened in the past, and therefore what does the future look like? Because if we don't know those two things, then we can't design for the future. And Harrington's a fantastic example of that. So we've started to grow this place right from the bottom up, with landscape first. So in this little diagram, you can see the landscape that's existing is the first thing that really starts to shape the place. And then we've shown in this diagram the kind of layering that sits on top of that. So another key element of the place was the first site visit, going on site. I'll talk about this more slightly later, standing on the high point, looking out and seeing what the views are. The next kind of level looks at views and vistas. So building on top of that, can you see the local windmill? Yes, that's great. That's really important. Can you see the church spires from the surrounding villages? Brilliant, because they're landmarks and they're things that are comfortable, that people understand, that they connect with. So let's protect those and enhance them and shape our framework around this kind of great, rich landscape and network of places. And then, of course, on top of that, we're talking about the movement and connectivity that we've already talked about, and then the real placemaking and the nitty-gritty that feeds into that framework, as well as having a fantastic 21st century market town ecosystem, and bringing in all that rich innovation and research and development that Oxfordshire has. And of course, learning from that and working within it. So effectively, what we're trying to do is create a fantastic place built on partnerships, stewardship, and delivering everything that Oxfordshire can deliver in one place. It's a big ask, but hopefully we're going to get there. So what is it that makes this a special place and not just, as Matthew said, a housing estate in the countryside? And hopefully you'll see we're coming from a holistic approach. We want to get this right. We want to do it properly. We're engaging with a fantastic team of people, friends, colleagues, advocates, stakeholders, anyone that wants to be in the team, who are part of this partnership to grow something really special here. And I could talk about Harrington all day, but I'm very aware of the time, so I'm going to go quickly. But I will focus on a key thing that really sets this apart, and that is what we're calling the Chiltern View. And it's this point here where the little hand is. You may ask, what is that? But as you stand on the brow of the hill here on the site, there's an incredible view of the AONB and the Chilterns. It's panoramic, it's beautiful, it gives the character of the place and connects you with the surrounding landscape. And so Chiltern View became our fundamental concept for the development of the master plan. And for us, that is actually, it's now become our outdoor town centre. So our high street runs straight through the centre. The green space is the key space within the high street. It's framed by the shops, the cafes, the seed banks, the innovation centres, the homes, and they're all looking out onto this green space as the heart of the place, but also at this fantastic view in the context. Of course, there's so much other great stuff that goes into a master plan like this, which I will come on to, and I'll flick through the slides now. So we're creating a community that's people-led. We're promoting zero carbon lifestyles, that are ready to go. But this is also about the real basics, people meeting, engaging, working, learning, living together, places for the people. So, to give some examples, Sophie works from home, she walks the kids to school, she lives locally, she's got lots of free time because she doesn't have to travel because everything is here. Muriel wanted to get on the housing ladder because she was from Thames. She wanted to grow up live where she grew up. You know, it's about offering that for the local people and making this part of Oxfordshire and Thame and the surrounding towns. And Harrington is a new way of life. So it is zooming right back. It's about walking and cycling. It's about working from home in a hub from the local towns. It's about going to the local markets. It's having that kind of local life and all the great stuff that comes with it, because actually I think that's what everyone's realized that they want after the pandemic that we've been through. It's got local markets, it's got everything that you need. You might, well, maybe this is Matthew. Matthew might cycle back from work on his bike to clear his head. You know, it gives you the opportunity to, for example, Bev might be thinking about a new Etsy product, I don't know, and going for a walk in the countryside whilst he's doing it. It's really kind of getting back to basics and creating a heart and a town centre. This is a view of Chiltern View looking north and showing how the high street will run through the green space, and how the local market, the farmers market, will sit in the centre and help to activate the street. You know, we're talking about 15-minute walkable neighbourhoods and literally having everything you need, but also being well connected to the wider context. I know I've literally had 1 minute to go. And in doing that, we've been working with space syntax and looking at how we get these routes right now. So, you know, this is really kind of a key point of working as we go and evolving and phasing the development. So, you know, in doing that, it's about growing a new place. And we talked earlier quite a lot about what does make it sustainable and what makes it right. And it is that phased approach. There's no point fixing a vision and a master plan now and delivering over the next 50 years, because in 5 years' time, it will be redundant. So this is about a phased approach and creating a place at every stage from day one that grows holistically. And, you know, having that big picture on the puzzle box, but understanding that there are lots of parts of that journey and that story that fit together to create something really special. I will stop talking.
Thank you very much indeed for that. You've painted some fantastic pictures for us there, and there's a ton of detail in things like a market town ecosystem and what that actually means that I'd love to unpick another time. But for now, I mean, Bev, you can't comment directly on a plan that's being developed. That's yet to go before local authorities, but what is it that you'd like to pick out of that in terms of the sort of principles behind designing new places?
Thanks very much, Toby. I mean, and nice to see the presentation. You're absolutely right. But I think it's, as I started off the conversation today, what we need is to be able to have these aired in a public, open way, to be able to make sure that we can see the credentials of these new ideas. And I think what Hannah set out is particularly, and I recognize that sort of layering up of master planning, I think it starts to capture the public's imagination when they can start to see those elements that we are asking for in policy and in new developments actually coming to life and being able to see how that would work. Now, is that enough to get a local person who lives right next door to that area to go, yes, I'm all in? I'm not so sure. But what you ultimately want is fairness, transparency, and openness to be able to compare these apples to apples and say, yes, but are you going to get this kind of a quality of life from somewhere else? And I think that's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for the ability to be able to judge these things and raise the bar. I mean, if I can pick on one point, starting with the environment, starting with the landscape makes so much sense to me, because that is becoming more fundamental to what we value in our communities. If COVID taught us nothing else, it was about the ability to be able to access outdoors and to be able to access parts of our community that perhaps we took for granted before. So, and the last thing for me, Toby, is if the ARC, and I can't remember, I think it was Matthew that said it earlier, if the ARC is going to move away from, you know, the central ambition of a professional working in the ARC is where do I have to live so I can still get a seat on a train into London and become a place where they can work and live and enjoy working every day without having to go to London. You know, they may choose to go to London once in a while, but it doesn't become their sort of reason for living. These are the kind of principles that we want to be able to sell to that population as the ARC becomes a set of places where people live, work, and actually thrive. So that's the kind of thing we want to see. I think Hannah's picking on some of those principles. I really welcome the debate and welcome the discussion, and really glad we're seeing it out in the open. Thank you.
Let's see if we've taken the audience with us. Let's ask them again if they're confident that new settlements can create a functioning market town community founded on sound placemaking principles. While we ask Matthew to pick up on some of what we've heard there in terms of Harrington. And Matthew, there's something in this, isn't there, about starting with the landscape, the kind of fundamentals of the place, and enabling a place to become flexible, to be flexible to changes and changing conditions and the changing ways people want to live.
So yes, absolutely. Starting with the place and creating a place. And there's many versions of that, but we all understand what a great place to live is, a great neighborhood, because when we're looking for a home, we look for it. We don't just look at the house, we look at the pub, the neighborhood, the way things are done. And the key here is planning them on that basis. The local authority role and government role is to hold it to account to actually deliver on that. The private sector role is, frankly, to take a long-term investment role in it. House builders can build house builders for short term, but these involve placemakers who will get their return in that way. And you said earlier, I chair what's now the Carl Clays Garden Community, because it's taken so long to, we all have the scars of how long it takes to do these things. But it was originally one of the 3 eco towns that were approved by the government. I chair the strategic partnership, and that is a partnership of the landowner developer, Homes England, and Cornwall Council. It's private sector led, but nonetheless, it is being delivered by a board that brings together those 3 partners. And I think that is actually indicative of how these have to work. And there's different variations. There'll be more local authority led, there'll be more private led, but you always have to have that core partnership. But when I started, because it was an eco town, everyone said, well, it's going to have sustainable homes to a high standard, it'll have heat pumps, it'll have electric car charging points. A lot of these things at that time kind of sort of wildly optimistic futurism, whereas they're now standard. And I said, as an environmentalist, as someone who's campaigned on that, who won awards for my work on that, I said, actually, it's not about that. That stuff we will do, and that will be incorporated into it, and it will have to be incorporated. But for a sustainable place, the starting point is to build a sustainable community. And another master planner put it to me, he said, what you've got to do is create a place that is a destination in its own right, not for visitors from somewhere else, but when you walk out of your front door, you walk out not to the car to go somewhere else, but you walk out to the shop and the pub and the cafe, and you think, I'll take the kids to the park afterwards, and when I've dropped them off at the school, I'll walk around the corner to the cafe and meet my friend. We all understand that, and it is utterly different from a housing estate. And it's also utterly different from thinking that when you create a new community, it's about being on the link to somewhere else. The link to somewhere else is going to be a small part of the journey. Some people who will work in Oxford some of the time. Some people who will want to go to the swimming pool that may not be in the here or whatever it is, to go into London for the bright lights. And of course, you make that possible. But the irony of a new supplement is that I can provide the ability to walk and the services you need for day to day within that supplement. That's sustainable. And I can more likely get people to take public transport to go somewhere else, because why would you try and drive into Oxford and or Cambridge, hit a traffic jam, pay a massive amount for parking, sit in your car, take in the fumes, if firstly you can probably work from home because you put in great Wi-Fi, but when you do need to go in, the car outside the house maybe, but it's actually its own park and ride, because you can walk down to the bus centre, you'll get rapid travel into town, you'll get priority, there's no parking fees, and there's Wi-Fi on the bus while you do it. And that is much easier to deliver here than it is on a little housing estate on the edge of Oxford, which bluntly has no facilities, nothing to walk to. The school's on the other side of town, the work's on the other side of town, and the natural thing is to take the car, because why would you drive out to the park and ride when you're already in the town? You actually encourage people into their cars.
Absolutely. And of course, we're all in a place after COVID, or so many of us are in a place now where that kind of lifestyle is visible. We can see how it would work if only the infrastructure were in place, if only the place was designed to enable it. And hopefully you've gone some way to answering Catriona's Riddell's question in the Q&A there about connectivity as well. But sorry, Matthew, go ahead. Last word.
Post-coronavirus answer. It's right. This concept was developed before, but coronavirus has made us all aware of what it is this offers. It offers the park. It offers the house with the garden, because there's no shortage of green space, which gives, of course, the biodiversity and the sustainability. It offers the neighborhood shop and the place to work and the local school and the great Wi-Fi connectivity and the ability to do without the car. the next lockdown, where would you want to live? Do you want to live in the 10th floor of a high rise in the city where they're building up and up and up in order to protect us from the countryside and delivering deeply unsustainable living?
Yeah, well, Matthew, you've taken the audience with you. I suspect if we ran that poll again now, it will be even more in favour. But as it is, you managed to get the undecideds and the against from 37% down to 9%. In just an hour. So well done, panel. But that really is all we've got time for, because our viewers need to head off to get a sandwich, or perhaps to log into Rightmove to see if they can find a home in Harrington that they can get hold of to change their lifestyles and start the better part of their lives. Before you do that, viewers, please could you join me in a big round of virtual applause to thank our terrific panel for sharing their knowledge and insight and experience with us today. Thank you to Bev Hindle from the Oxford Cambridge Arc Leadership Group, and thank you Hannah Smart from Edge Urban Design, and thank you Lord Matthew Taylor, and a big thank you also to Summix for sponsoring this event and making it possible. But most of all, viewers, as ever, thank you for again tuning in and gracing us with your attention for longer than usual. I apologise, but I hope you agree with me that it was well worth it for the content that we've provided today. Thanks also for the questions you've been putting into the Q&A. There are a few left hanging, and we'll put those to the panel after the event and circulate their answers through the LinkedIn Members Club, which you can join freely. We're going to be back on Thursday at 11 a.m. talking about delivering better outcomes and preparing for the construction playbook with Scape and another superb panel. So register for that at 3fox.co.uk. And if today's conversations whetted your appetite and you'd like to get involved in our sessions as a sponsor or a speaker, then email me at toby@3fox.co.uk. Meanwhile, until Thursday, from our fantastic panel, from Summix, from me, and from everyone at 3Fox, thank you and good afternoon.